And welcome once again to Strange Planet. Thanks for sticking me in your ear. Great to have you with me. You know, from time to time, I like to introduce to you my faithful, dedicated Strange Planet subscribers, listeners, to others who are out there toiling in the same arena, namely the conspiracies and the unexplained and the paranormal. And we're going to do that right now. I guess the first thing I would say is I can't believe that I've not spoken with this gentleman before. And he is the host of a podcast many of you may already be familiar with. It's called the Higherside Chats. And Greg Carlwood had a pretty stereotypical Midwestern middle-class upbringing. Grew up in Missouri, suburban Missouri. Spent his formative years in the local Catholic school, causing some disruption along the way by his own admission, and attended St. Pius High School in Festus, Missouri. He was kicked out on the first day of senior year, and apparently he's still bitter about it. Maybe we'll get into that, maybe not. Eventually, he made his way to the University of Missouri, where, by his own admission, he studied nothing and dropped out and wandered into corporate retail management, captaining such notable ships as Great American Cookies, the Sunglass Hut, Gamestop. And knowing this was a low-paying road to nowhere and not feeling right in Missouri, Greg moved on to San Diego, California, with a desperation plan, some call it the Hail Mary Pass, to grow marijuana. After growing a few successful crops, but not knowing anyone who actually buys marijuana by the pound, Greg started another desperation venture, the Higherside Chats Podcast, and this one stuck. This one worked out fabulously. And a great delight to have Greg Carlwood on the program, on the podcast. Greg, how are you?
Hey, I'm good, man. Serenity now. I really am a true everyman, and I had a little fun with that bio because what do you say when you never really accomplished much until your podcast took off?
Yeah, and I love on the website, you've kind of got a schematic of how how the podcast came together. It's very clever, and so it's been. What I think you described 2014 or 2013 as kind of the first official launch, the first podcast in 2013 after kind of experimenting with it a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I was really doing it in 2010, but I started by interviewing local comedians, and I would try to get them to talk about conspiracy, and they didn't have the knowledge or really even the interest to do so. So after a while, I was like, man, I could do this better. This could be better. I don't even know if I'd listen to this if I stumbled upon it. And then I interviewed Michael Tessarian, who was a great researcher, still is, but at the time he was definitely high on my list. And I finished that interview and I just loved it. And then from then on, I went down the conspiracy path. And back then in 2010, there weren't a lot of podcasts, but I still felt late to the game. Little did I know how many podcasts there would be. But I always kind of said I wanted to be a more mellow Alex Jones and a less Christian Coast to Coast and try to blend the middle in somewhere there. But Alex Jones would scream over all of his guests, and Coast to Coast had so many ads that they would always be just trying to get into something before they'd break. And those were the two things I wanted to avoid. And it's been pretty successful.
And here we are. Here we are.
Here we are.
Let me ask you about America's, we're all undergoing some tumultuousness right now, obviously.
Yes.
And we all have darker chapters in our history. And I know you wanted to focus a little bit tonight on America's hidden history, and this is something I've talked about at great length over the years. Where would you like to begin with that? When we're talking about America's hidden history, are we talking about JFK? Are we talking about the Civil War? Where do you want to start?
Well, there's clearly a lot of stuff that could be talked about, but what really sent me down that rabbit hole was just looking for odd terms in the newspaper archives. If you go on some of these websites, they have cataloged newspapers back to the 1800s. And if you put in strange words like giants, you then get served up all these articles, and it's like, yeah, 3 guys digging up a railroad over here. They discovered 8-foot tall bodies, and with them were tools that were for 8-foot tall people. And then you go a little bit deeper. I just recently interviewed this guy, Analog, who has made this his thing. He is somewhat anonymous, but he has a knack for using these databases to extract mind-blowing stuff. And some of the things that really blew my mind were these underground chambers that really did not fit the description of what I thought these underground chambers were like. I thought they were caves with maybe some basic Bronze Age type tools and things, but he's describing massive bas relief statues, like something out of ancient Egypt. He's describing an architecture, like a giant arch across the entire room that holds it up like an inverse bridge. And this isn't natural by any means. And I don't know how you would do it without modern equipment, but the stuff that he talks about just was really crazy to me. And it's not just 1 or 2 things. It's like dozens and dozens of articles of underground wild stuff. Another thing was a 4-acre mass grave of 3-foot tall people somewhere in like Tennessee.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what's that? An acre is not a small amount of space. So just weird things like that. Obviously, people talk about the giants, but
Right.
when you really look at the details, you only get a few sentences sometimes. But when they're telling you this isn't just an underground cave, this is a giant room that was constructed, you got to wonder, like, is this a system that gets reset every so often? And we might be coming up on one because the pressure is intense right now. But it's hard to imagine that this idea of straight linear progress that we have could be true when you see some of these things dug out of the archives. You could say maybe the newspapers had it wrong, I guess, but I think they seem like a valid source of trying to reconstruct the old world.
Right. Yes. I mean, if people have the time and the patience and they want to go and look at the old newspaper archives on microfiche, ask your grandparents about microfiche, kids. You're right. The newspapers are filled up and down the Ohio Valley. There was even, it wasn't the New York Times. It might have been something like the New York Observer from the late 19th century, talking about farmers who plowed over one of these burial mounds or these huge mounds in somewhere in the Ohio Valley and uncovered, huge skeletons. And then the question is, what happened to them? Did someone from the Smithsonian, I don't know, pack them away somewhere? Are they in a big Indiana Jones type warehouse?
That's the rumor.
$1 million question, right?
Yeah, that is the rumor. It seems like in a lot of these articles, the last couple lines are, it was sent to the Smithsonian for further investigation. And you ask them today and they're like, we never got anything. It's like, isn't that something? Isn't that curious?
Do you know the story of Abraham Lincoln when he was up in Niagara Falls? When he wasn't president, he was campaigning for, I'm not sure which president, during an election, obviously. He was up in Niagara Falls and he made this strange speech. He was commenting on this would have been, I think, around 1855. He was remarking about the amazing natural beauty of the Niagara Falls. And then out of nowhere, he starts talking about these mounds, these burial mounds, and the giant bones inside the burial mounds.
Wow.
And some people have tried to explain that away. Oh, he was referring to mastodon bones, but he clearly said in this speech, giants.
That's interesting.
Which leads me to think that at a certain point, this was just common knowledge. It was talked about normally the way you and I are talking about it. There wasn't any controversy about talking about giant skeletons inside these mounds.
Right. It seems to be that way because these articles are written very matter-of-factly as well. And a lot of times they reference other articles. They say, hey, here in Marion County, we discovered something like they have over in Jefferson County. And it's like, well, then it's not even just one thing, but they just say it so matter of fact. And I don't know, maybe it has something to do with our mindset and our willingness to contemplate strange things and myth and just all kinds of oddities that might have existed at the time. There's really not much mysticism left in our general mainstream culture. So it also does seem like there clearly was a campaign to stuff all this stuff back in the box. But now it sounds so weird, though to them it didn't seem very odd.
What do you suppose is so threatening about the idea that there were perhaps, I mean, we can leave, the biblical account of giants aside and just assume, okay, this was just another race of humanoid.
Right.
The same with, the legend of the Cherokee Little People, which you alluded to earlier. What's so threatening about that, do you think, to the establishment, to the academic orthodoxy, scientific orthodoxy?
Yeah, it's such a good question. There's only a couple possibilities in my mind. One, they want to preserve the story of America's founding and history. They don't want people to know just how many people were here before. We already know there were Native Americans, so that doesn't really hold up to me. Who cares how tall they were? We already know that there were people here before the settlers came. So that's a weird one. But I think it's probably biblical, to be honest with you. I mean, maybe they don't want to let us know about previous rounds of advanced civilization, but some of the researchers that I'm sure we both talked to that get into the story of the fallen angels and then the Nephilim, some people think that the elite bloodlines are really descendants of this cross breeding between fallen angels and fair women in the ancient past. That's why they're so obsessed with managing their bloodlines. That's why they feel like they have the birthright to rule. And maybe it's that, because you're right. It just, who cares? We have humans, Neanderthals, and this other thing. Why the big cover up? It seems strange, unless it's something about this was a race that was kind of like half angel or something. And then they don't want anyone to know about that history because it just unravels into something that is pretty epic and strange. And it might get people to really wonder what other secrets are out there. It might be just too big of a secret, but on the surface, it doesn't seem like it should be that big of a deal.
No, it seems like that's another question. The elites, let's say, the ruling class, they circle their wagons around a certain number of topics. I guess it's to prevent the connecting the dots people, which would be people like you and me, because it's almost like in medicine, and one of the things that the medical establishment is very adamant about is, fluoridation in the water.
Yeah.
And they will not let that go. I mean, if people are rising up and holding elections and filling out petitions to get rid of the fluoride in their water with some limited success over the last few years. But it's like they've circled their wagons around fluoride, because once they admit they're wrong about fluoride, then vaccines and everything else, well, vaccines are now being questioned. And they're really circling their wagons, aren't they? So maybe it's the same way with giants, because if we seed ground with giants, then pretty soon they're going to connect the dots between giants and UFOs and something else, and then the whole house of cards comes tumbling down.
Well, I agree with you. That's why I kind of mentioned, if there are resets and if we are in some kind of simulation or matrix that just, it goes up, it comes down, like a sine wave, we have to be, I would think, near a breaking point. I mean, an apocalypse is really just a revealing, but the insinuation is that it's also disastrous. And I would think that's because the revealing causes people to kind of lose their shit, and they don't really want to go to work tomorrow. They don't trust the system anymore. They don't value money. Just all kinds of things can happen. And I think they really want to preserve that, but there's so many cracks in the wall. Vaccines are a crack. I mean, just before we started, I was looking at the news there, and I don't know if I'm just in a certain reality tunnel and a certain research bubble, but it seems like the dam is breaking, even in a more mainstream way. I don't know if that's ever going to penetrate the three big networks, or really the two big networks that aren't going to talk about that. And some people aren't going to believe it until it's on those networks, but they're also losing credibility by the day because there are more people doing their own research, listening to the great guests that we have on, and they're like, man, something's not right here. So it seems like maybe things are coming to a head, and that's probably also why they're throwing so many highly charged things at us. You know, the Russia-Ukraine thing. Now it seems like they're pivoting over to, hey, China's a big threat too. Let's not forget about that. And the military industrial complex is just foaming at the mouth to get us into a giant war. And it's like you kind of have to throw things at people constantly so they don't have any time to get their footing and actually think deeply about one particular subject. It's on to the next thing. The Chinese spy balloon. How funny that the story's full of hot air, the balloon's full of hot air. It's a very symbolic kind of story, archetypical thing to present to people. And then they shoot down 3 UFOs, quote unquote, and then they can't find the debris. That doesn't even make sense to me that they can't find it. And who goes around shooting things down that they have yet to identify? Feels like there'd be all kinds of legal ramifications for doing stuff like that. It's never really been a known thing in the history that I can remember of just shooting things down, not finding them, not identifying them, not worrying about them, and moving on. That's strange. 3 in like 3 days. So there's a lot of weird stuff going on. They seem to be wanting us to be distracted by anything and everything but the truth, though the dam is breaking in a lot of ways. That's why it's like, maybe we are coming up on something where they got to press the big panic button and send us back to the Stone Age and start again.
Right, right. Well, what do you think about the idea that we are already in World War III? This is sort of like, fifth generational warfare, where you can't even separate the combatants anymore because they're not necessarily in uniform, and it's kind of an information warfare as well. What do you think about that idea?
Yeah, I think it has merit. Like when Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, we consider that the start of World War I, but how many people just living their lives knew that it started? You have to kind of wait till the war is over to then reverse engineer where historians might set the beginning of it. And it seems like they would have said it when Russia stepped into Ukraine, because, the official story is like that was the act of aggression. Though if you surround someone and you start encroaching on someone, eventually they're going to feel like they're backed into a corner and they're going to be like, okay, enough's enough. This is where we stop. Because I think you could really say World War III was started. If you're going to go all the way back, it'd be like when they promised not to encircle Russia with NATO countries and not to keep coming at them. But that's what prompted Russia to invade. Though the news starts the story with, well, Russia invaded. It's like kids on a schoolyard. A bully is just intimidating this kid, and then he punches them, and it's like, see, he did it. He did it. Get this kid, lock him up.
Mm-hmm.
Who really started a fight? It's always kind of up for debate based on perspective, but it seems like this is always kind of the American empire, the globalists. They're always poking and prodding, and no one really does much, but Russia decided that enough was enough. And I think there's, validity in that case.
Is Russia the enemy, or are we the enemy? We the people?
Oh yeah, of them. It is. I think they have a real disdain for people in general. I can't imagine that they care about health, because they pump water to our houses with lead pipes full of fluoride, like you mentioned. Our food is awful quality. So it's like, where is this caring about human beings? You want them to get vaccinated for COVID. You want them to wear masks. You care so much about their health and well-being. But where are we seeing you really foster a robust and healthy citizenry? Because I don't see it anywhere. That's kind of the thing I had said about like punk rock is like being a farmer now, because I grew up listening to punk rock music and it was so anti-establishment, and these were largely the Bush years. So people are rallying against the war machine. And I guess now that I'm older, these bands are older, they just turned out to be liberals. Like they don't have the same bite anymore. Maybe they're too comfortable. Maybe they've made too much money, but they seem to be shilling for every single thing that the government and corporations want them to shill for. And it's like, what happened to your anti-establishment views? And so now I think, well, what is truly anti-establishment now? It's you got to throw out all the things they give us that are not serving us. And you got to go get a cabin in the woods, and you got to start growing your own organic food, find a local rancher that you can get your meat from, and get the Wi-Fi signals and all the EMF away from you, and just try to live a good life. But I mean, the truly anti-establishment now is you got to kind of be self-sufficient. I mean, I guess prepping, it's always been in the mix there. Like that's been a thing, but it's time to kind of put your money where your mouth is, because if you're suckling the teat of society, I mean, that's all things that are hurting your state of health. So yeah, I think we are the enemy, because they're slowly poisoning us and slowly weakening us across the board. And you look at what they put on TV, they don't even allow the debate to go on anymore. When I was growing up, I would watch some of these debate shows, Hannity and Combs, like, even though I didn't care necessarily about the material and it's still mainstream news, I liked to see the drama of debate. Now it's just droning on with the script. And then people put together compilations of 40 different networks reading the exact same script, using the exact same language. So there is no debate. Obviously, their loss is our gain, right? Because podcasts are where real conversations actually take place. But yeah, I have to say we're the enemy, because they treat us like you would treat an enemy. They definitely don't treat us like you would treat a friend, or like a nurturing parent would treat somebody under their custody. Like, there's nothing good coming from the establishment anymore, if there ever was.
Greg Carlwood is the host of the Higherside Chats. We're going to step away here. Just before we do, though, Greg, how do we listen? How do we subscribe?
Well, it's everywhere podcasts are, but the HighersideChats.com makes it pretty easy, or search in any podcast app for the Higherside Chats.
All right. We'll take a quick timeout, come back. More of our conversation awaits. Don't go anywhere. Well, it's a podcast. I'm in your ear. Where are you going to go? Every new season, we find a reason to improve our lives and our health. And C60 Evo organic edible oils deliver noticeable benefits quickly. A spoonful in the morning delivers energy and endurance all day long. And I sleep deeper and wake up feeling refreshed because C60 ESS60 works. Carbon 60 received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1996 when it was used for industrial applications. C60 Evo's ESS60 is a breakthrough technology upgrading C60 to be safe for human and pet consumption. ESS60 has been called a miracle molecule because of the physical and mental benefits people are enjoying. Their lab has a proven track record of 31 years and thousands of happy customers across the world, just like me. So treat yourself, your friends, and your family to C60 Evo and use my link, EVRS, to get 10% off your first order. Again, my link, EVRS, to get 10% off your first order. You can tell I'm an old radio guy. I still use old-style radio formatics. Reset every 15 minutes. Remind people who you're talking to. It's a podcast. But I just can't let those trappings, I can't let them go. Greg Carlwood is with us, and he is the host of the Higherside Chats. Also, you have a wonderful line of clothing, Conspiratees. Conspiratees? Am I saying that right?
Yeah, that's obviously the pun. I ended up changing it to just the Higherside clothing because there were other companies using it. Even though when I was very broke, still working at Gamestop, I paid a lot of money to own the name, the patent. I have a buddy who actually is a patent lawyer. I was like, I'll throw you a bone and we'll get this thing done. And you just find that nobody cares. Nobody respects that. So you got all these companies using Conspiratees because it's generic and easy to come up with. And so I thought, well, no one's going to steal the Higherside clothing. No one's going to end up promoting my podcast for me. So, and I still get to keep the THC thing going. But yeah, t-shirt sales are in the mix. I like putting wild stuff on shirts. And if people are bold enough to wear that at the grocery store, then more power to them.
Great. We were talking earlier about, it's the title of a Van Morrison song, Where Have All the Rebels Gone? And I was thinking about when you were talking about punk rock, and they weren't punk, but like Rage Against the Machine. think about the
Oh,
name of that band. Now they have a reunion tour, but in order to attend their concert, you have to be doubly vaxxed.
yeah.
Rage Against the Machine. What happened?
I
What
know, man. The same thing with there was a concert my buddy wanted to go to is Blink 182, Green Day, Weezer. None of these bands are particularly edgy. They are more corporate punk rock, but still, same thing. You got to be vaccinated, and it made a lot of things awkward because even when it seemed like the dust had settled, I'd have friends who'd ask me to do things. I'm like, well, you can go, but I can't go. Sorry. And I didn't necessarily hate it because I wanted them to realize, look, this isn't over for me. You played ball, but there are consequences for me. And I want you to find that to be outrageous. And I want you to like maybe think about the fact that there's two different classes of citizen now. And I would say at this point, it's pretty much died down, but you hear these whisperings, these rumblings of another round. Like I said, they keep hitting us with things. Bill Gates is like, hey, there's going to be another round of smallpox. The next pandemic's going to be even worse. Listen to these people when they say this stuff. They're not usually wrong because they pull the strings. So I definitely think it's possible something else could come out. Then you got the contingency of our conspiracy community that thinks viruses aren't even real and that whole paradigm is made up. And terrain theory is key. I do think terrain theory is key. The terrain of your body, make it as robust as possible, and small pathogens won't affect you. But does that mean there are no pathogens in the world? I don't think so. And especially, could you engineer a pathogen to be, something that in nature doesn't hurt us, but now it does because it's been engineered to hurt us? That's kind of the page I'm on, because the CDC director, he just gave this big testimony and he basically explained, they asked him, hey, when COVID started and you looked at this thing, did you think it was engineered? And he's like, yeah, I kind of did, because the receptor here was a human receptor, not a bat one. So how did that happen? So I think, we can get sick even without these virology labs trying to make us sicker, but I think they can create things that make us sick for a while. Maybe they don't spread as much as they'd want. Maybe nature self-corrects along the way, and then they use the media and they use the protocols and they take out the helpful things like ivermectin to basically put everybody in as sick a state as possible. But even then, we still didn't get that sick. So it's crazy out there, man.
Well, exactly, and it's getting crazier because, as you say, so the pandemic has gone away for a while, and be on the lookout for the next tabletop exercise for the bird flu, which is always kind of a red flag whenever there's a tabletop exercise attended by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Johns Hopkins and the WEF and so forth, run for the hills.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's also now we're talking about, President Biden is trying to push for this central bank digital currency. We have a big push for empowering the World Health Organization so that they have basically the ability to override nation states and governance in terms of defining when a pandemic is happening and how to respond to it, and lockdowns and mask mandates. And now we're talking about 15-minute cities and being locked into our own neighborhood and making it illegal to own a car. I mean, how do you, I'm always kind of curious, because we're toiling in the same vineyard, so to speak, how you deal with that barrage, processing this material, talking about it every day or every week without just going absolutely batshit crazy.
Well, I do think a sense of humor is key. You kind of got to keep it light to an extent, or at least keep, perspective, a vibe of lightness, even when you're talking about really dark things. But yeah, I have a 1.5-year-old kid now. My wife's pregnant again. We're moving out of the state of California. We're moving where family is. We're moving to Florida, which happens to be more of a freedom loving place apparently. But I just think that the tides can change at any point, and I don't really have this hero worship of Ron DeSantis like other people do. I was reading that he actually was involved with creating the legal framework for an enhanced interrogation at Guantanamo Bay. So like he's in the mix like everybody else. But on this particular COVID thing, he seems to be saying the right stuff that makes people want to come to Florida. But yeah, having young kids definitely amps things up a little bit. Back when I started the show, it was all just fun and games. UFOs, aliens, Loch Ness Monster. No big
Nobody
deal.
gets hurt. Nobody gets hurt. Yeah.
Yeah, nobody gets hurt. And now it's like these campaigns happen, and I never wanted to be wrong about stuff. Some things are non-consequential. So, who really cares? But when the vaccine issue started coming up more and more, and then COVID happened, like I really had to do a deep dive into like forming an opinion, like, okay, because you don't want to get this wrong, because you don't want to steer your audience wrong. Now, if you're listening to the college dropout stoner podcaster for all your medical advice, that's on you. But still, I wanted to make sure I had the right guests who were on the right page. And so it got really intense. I think it did for anyone who's in this space. And the consequences for being wrong got higher. And I'm very proud of the guests that I had and the quickness in which I feel like I figured out what the alternative is to a lot of this stuff. But yeah, it's hard to not drive yourself too crazy. Luckily, the Higherside Chats is such a broad name. No one knows what it's supposed to be. It's not like I went for the Black Pilled show or the conspiracy show where you're stuck in a lane. So I can always throw in a show about near-death experience or whatever, whenever it starts to get really heavy. So sometimes we just throw in a Mothman show so I can cool off for a day or two.
I used to have it was called the Conspiracy Show. I had a radio show, and I changed the name to Strange Planet for that express purpose.
Yeah.
Because sometimes it's also for the host. I mean, constantly talking about this can be kind of demoralizing, and once in a while you got to cleanse the palate with some Bigfoot talk or something like that, just so that you can live and thrive and to fight another day.
It's
so
true.
I'm totally with you on that. Let's kind of just switch gears here, and let's I don't know about lightening things up a little bit, but certainly changing gears. And that is, you had an experience with a cryptid as a child. Tell me about that.
Yeah, I've told this story a lot because it's just one of the few stories that I actually have on a personal level. Like guests talk about all kinds of amazing things. But when I was in kindergarten age, my parents moved and bought a house in a developing subdivision. So there were some houses, there were some woods still around, and we were just walking around a cul-de-sac, and I saw something down in a ravine at the edge of the woods. And as soon as I saw it, it was kind of hunched over in the posture of like Golem from Lord of the Rings, and like a hunched back kind of thing, not quite on all fours, but humanoid. And when I saw it, it immediately turned and looked directly at me, and it saw me as well. And that was like the first box that gets checked in a lot of these stories, that it seems like just when you look at something, it notices you, and it's like, oh shit, this person shouldn't be seeing me. I guess I dropped my cover, my veneer, my cloak of invisibility. And so this thing, it looked, oddly, there's not a box I can put it in. I can't say it was Bigfoot. I can't say it was like a dog man. It was a humanoid that kind of, I guess, maybe forest spirit. It wasn't translucent or transparent or anything, but you hear about elementals of the forest kind of stuff, and it may be something in that realm. But I was with my parents. I'm in kindergarten. I'm not walking around alone. They're about a couple 100 feet away from me. So I say, Mom, Dad, come here quick. There's like a weird bear down here, which was the first descriptor I could come up with. So they think I'm pranking them. They're not rushing over to me. And as I'm trying to process it, I say, no, it's like a strange rhino. And of course, there's no rhinoceroses in Missouri. And I didn't say that because it had a horn, but as I was trying to look at different details, I noticed I thought its skin looked like rhino skin. It looked like gray. It looked like hulking, like a bear type shape, but it didn't have fur. It had this weird gray alien type skin. And then it just took a few steps and it was gone, and it just disappeared. And I was in tears. I was really upset because not that I was scared of what I saw, but I was so frustrated being the only one who saw it. I was like, if my mom and dad would have just moved faster, they would have saw it. And then I wouldn't be stuck with this forever. I made them go door to door and ask people whose houses were there if they've ever seen anything weird. Obviously they hadn't. And now that I'm older, I know that like, it's probably wasn't some animal roaming around down there, some human animal hybrid. It was probably something of a spiritual nature, a multidimensional nature that manifested for a moment and then dissipated, because that's the story I hear all the time from so many different people. And for the longest time, when I'd interview people, I'd say, I never have seen anything weird, and I knew I had that story, but it's just so brief and it's so unexplainable and doesn't fit a category. And the stories you hear from guests are so epic. I'm like, man, I wish I experienced something like that. You know, ships landing, little green guys coming out with devices and measuring the grass and then getting back in the ship and going. I mean, there's some wild tales out there, but I think the commonalities are when you see it, if you're seeing it, you're seeing its back, it just spins around and sees you. And then it quickly realizes it needs to get back to being invisible. And that's really the biggest commonality, I would say, that happened for me. As I talked to guests, I thought, you know, was I in a heightened state of emotion? Did I experience some trauma? No, nothing like that. So it's not like there was anything weird going on a emotional or consciousness level. It was really just a mundane walk around the neighborhood. It wasn't nighttime. It might have been like twilight-ish, you know, sun might have been setting, but there was enough light to clearly see what I was looking at. But strange. That's the strangest thing I've ever seen.
Now, and looking back now, in retrospect, do you think that and seeing where you are now and what you how you make your living, your career now, do you think that maybe, as fleeting as it was, sort of sealed the deal in terms of what you would end up doing, exploring the unexplained and so forth?
I think about that a lot, because some folks talk about the fact that we experience life linearly, but that sometimes maybe in the future you can actually do things that affect your past and retrocausality. And there's some really weird concepts out there, but there are a few bullet points in my past that I think really speak to me being kind of destined to host a podcast in this realm. That was one, but there was another time where I wasn't wearing a seatbelt as a young kid. And I got this message in my head, put your seatbelt on right now. And I did. And then my mom got T-boned. We got in a really bad accident. And so I've always kept that kind of up in my head. It's like, well, you saw weird things. So when people say they see weird things, don't dismiss them. You've had a message come to your head right before a major accident that probably saved your life. So that's probably a thing. I also almost got kidnapped as a kid. I was playing in front of my house and this weird truck pulled up and this guy was like, hey, come here. And I got a really bad vibe and I ran inside and told my mom, and we told the cops, and the cops found the guy, and the guy said he was just looking for his kid who was at a neighbor's house and he didn't know which house it was. And it's like, well, there's only one kid out and I wasn't your kid. But that really messed me up, because I thought that just by telling the cops and knowing that this guy didn't get in any trouble, he didn't really commit a crime. So what are you going to do? Lock the guy up? I mean, you can't do anything. But as a kid, I was like, well, this guy knows exactly where I live and he knows I told the cops and he wanted to get me. That'll mess a kid up. There's not a lot you can do about it. But so that made me realize that there are bad people in the world that could grab you, and that child trafficking is probably a real thing, and it's probably more pervasive than we realize. And I'm also deaf in my right ear, which happened when I was 3. They say that I got meningitis from playing in like dirty water and got a bacteria in my ear and got meningitis, and I'm deaf. But 3 years old is also when you get a lot of vaccinations. And if you watch Del Bigtree's Vaxxed, he covers a story that in Canada, there was a tainted batch of vaccines that caused meningitis in a bunch of kids. Could a similar shipment have ended up in Missouri? I mean, there's clearly a precedent that has happened before. And, you know, yes, the terrain theory people, they would say that it probably was Big Pharma's intervention that caused me to have this injury. I don't know, but these are all things I think about as I've done the show. It's like, man, I thought I had a pretty mundane childhood, and the years go by and you only have like 5 experiences, sure, but you start pulling them out and you're like, yeah, maybe there's something to it. All these little things gave me insights to how the world might work. And so now I don't take much for granted. I'm sure you might feel the same way.
Yeah, I had a pretty idyllic childhood. I had a couple of paranormal, supernatural experiences.
Okay.
One of which happened fairly recently, so that really didn't, change the trajectory. I was already on this path. But one, many, many years ago, just after my father died, and the day he was actually buried, and seeing late at night, seeing my doppelganger hovering above me in bed.
Whoa.
Yeah, and, I actually, years later, somebody asked me, anything strange ever happened to you? And I completely forgot about it or dismissed it. I don't know what that is, if that's a defense mechanism, or I just buried it so deeply that I truly did forget about it momentarily. But never seen a UFO. Never had a cryptid sighting. I'd love to, at a distance.
Yeah.
Well,
that's the weird thing about our culture, is it causes you to forget about these things because we don't talk about them. The ridicule factor is very real, and it does affect people. Now that I've had some success, I have a crazy wrap on my car that has like a bunch of my logos and tentacles everywhere and a UFO and a pentagram. So there are times, it's always when I don't really want to talk to someone, but there are times where I'll be like leaving a grocery store and someone's standing at my car. I'm like, hey man, what's going on? And they're like, I saw a UFO once. Like, that's cool. That's cool. And this happens a lot, whether it's maybe a plumber or electrician comes to the place and sees the car, and then they're telling me a story about their grandpa who was a pilot. It's so common when you give people an olive branch, you give them an opening, and then they take it. The most interesting one that happened recently was a guy in a parking lot told me he saw a UFO. I'm strapping my kid Theory into the car, and she's throwing a fit, so I'm not really in the mood to talk. But this guy says, yeah, but it wasn't really a UFO. It was more like an angel. And I'm like, now I'm in, because I love the crossover between UFOs and angels and fairies and just the paranormal being more Fortean and the high strangeness stuff. I don't like the sci-fi kind of aliens anymore. I like the more metaphysical type stuff. So this is right up my alley. So I'm like, sure, man. Wow. An angel. That's interesting. Well, what did it look like? And he said it looked like a bunch of concentric rings spinning around a ball of light, and it had 4 wings. He's like, kind of like Ezekiel's wheel. I'm like, hey, it's another notch on the bingo card. You're hitting all the high points for me. And then I say, well, did it interact with you? Did it give you some psychedelic vision? He's like, yeah, actually, it told me it was going to fix a health problem I had by correcting my 4th chakra. And it did. And then it zoomed up into the sky. And he's like, my condition was healed. I'm like, huh. All right, man. Well, see you later.
Just another day at the office for Greg Carlwood.
Exactly. But that was really cool because I don't hear that very often. One time I was with some friends in LA, and we were by the docks of where all the boats are. And we were going to a buddy's house, and some guy comes running down the dock, and he's like, hey, I see your car. Can I show you something? It's like, all right, here we go. He was like, I got to show you something on my phone. Can you come on my houseboat? My friends are all looking at me like, are we going to go on this guy's houseboat? I'm like, we are. We really are. And he pulls out his phone and he shows me a video he captured of a UFO. And it was kind of standard, nothing super crazy, but a big spinning craft in the sky. Looked kind of like a conventional flying saucer, but not quite so disc shaped, maybe a little more oval shaped, but he had it. It was fuzzy and it was, shaky cam footage, but he's like, I got this myself. I believe it because it's that kind of footage on your cell phone. It's like all these things, you just shrug your shoulders and say, all right, man, see you later. But it's cool. It's kind of a cool thing I didn't expect when I put that stuff on my car that random people would just tell me. But it's like everybody's got a story, or their parents had a story, or their grandpa had a story, and they just don't tell it. Decades go by and they just don't tell it. So how are we supposed to know how much weirdness is out there?
Right. And well, you're rendering a public service because you're giving people an opportunity, an opening to unburden themselves, something they may have, as you say, carried around with them for forever, or when they did share it, they were mocked and ridiculed. So it's important. We have to honor those interactions. We'll take another quick time out. November reminds us to be thankful and focused on boosting our radiant health before winter. And I use a potent remedy that's improved the quality of my life and deepened my sleep as well. I take C60 Evo olive oil every morning, and I have a lot more energy and mental focus all day long. My workouts are easier, and I have a lot more endurance. If you're into competitive sports, this is a game changer. Health is our greatest wealth, and Pura C60 ESS60 really works. ESS60 is a breakthrough technology delivering the carbon-60 miracle molecule for humans and pets. Check out the C60 Evo holiday gift collections for everyone on your list. They make amazing skin, lip, and hair repair serum that deliver noticeable results quickly. C60 Evo's lab has an impressive track record of 31 years and, of course, my personal recommendation. You deserve the best remedies on earth, and so do those you love. Buy direct from the lab and upgrade your life today. Use my code EVRS to save 10% off your first order. Again, my code EVRS and save 10% off your first order. And welcome back. Greg Carlwood is with us. We're having a good time. Host of the Higherside Chats, the Highersidechats.com, the Highersidechats.com. Everything you need to know is right there. We were talking about angels and aliens and kind of that crossover. Do you think that there is kind of a common denominator that explains most paranormal / supernatural phenomena, like, for example, the late Rosemary Ellen Guiley was a regular on my program, and she wrote a lot about the jinn, kind of from Middle Eastern culture, talking about the jinn, and she believed that the jinn might be one of those common denominators that explains alien abductions and hauntings and so forth. What do you think about that?
I would agree. I think that we have a tendency to categorize things, and really we should get away from that. That's a human tendency. The alien stuff largely was colored by Roswell, was colored by Hollywood. It took us in that direction. But guys like Joshua Cutchin have done amazing work taking all the major themes of ufology and all the major themes of fairy lore and showing that it's like one-to-one correlation across the board, like stealing people at night, focusing on children, weird gifting exchanges. And I think probably you could extend it out to the jinn, to Bigfoot. There's a lot of weird stuff out there that seems to have the ability to shapeshift. Potentially there's higher realms of less dense intelligences out there, and they can sometimes manifest into our lower, denser reality. And maybe it's brief. Sometimes they seem to be able to be called by either occultists doing the right rituals, or Dr. Greg Little and Andrew Collins have written some great books. I think Origins of the Gods is the last one. Everybody's writing about the gods, Fingerprints of the Gods, all this, Chariots of the Gods. I think theirs is Origins of the Gods, but they equate the mounds and the stone circles with shamanism, and with there being these places where shamans for centuries in the past were calling things down. So things kind of figured out the map that if they want to interact, come down here in this place, because that's where the interactions happen. And sometimes these beings actually put ideas in their head like, hey, if you build this way, it'll help me out and I can be here for a longer period of time. Some people think that's what the Ark of the Covenant was, instructions for the voice of God. Well, take it out of the religious context, and it's the voice of some intelligence that is non-human out there in the world that basically built a telephone or taught man how to build a telephone over here. Tesla apparently used to say that he got voices in his head and ideas. It's like, well, if you're on the other side and you can reach someone on this side and they can physically toil and make something that makes your sustained contact easier, I think that stuff probably happens. It's kind of like Close Encounters of the Third Kind. He's like messing with his mashed potatoes. Like, This whole idea, people like, I've got to build something. Well, where'd that idea come? Why are you suddenly obsessed with building something? And what is it for? Who is it for? Who gave you that idea? There's all kinds of interactions, I think, with either multidimensional or higher planed beings. And there's probably a wide range. I interviewed Gerald Clark once, who put this idea in my head that we all know that when we use our senses, they filter more out than they filter in. We know that. It'd be chaos if we saw everything all at once. So our visible light spectrum is limited, our hearing is limited, or even our smell is limited. Like everything, we can look at the animal kingdom and find animals that have way better senses than us across the board. I guess touch is pretty basic, like you touch things or you don't. But he has this whole premise about the Anunnaki engineering man. And if you're getting into genetic tinkering and you can control the visible light spectrum, I mean, maybe we've been genetically engineered to not see life all around us.
Or like mole rats.
Yeah, just like one dimension away, 1 degree away, there might be all kinds of life, and we can't see it because in our ancient past, we were engineered to not see it. And maybe our engineers live in that frequency.
Fascinating. Any thoughts on the, I mean, this is a huge topic. Every one of these things that we've discussed are episodes all on their own. And I know you've covered most, if not all of them, but any thoughts on the simulated reality theory that we're living in a matrix?
Well, it's obviously a popular idea. I think as an analogy, it works really well because we are in an era of video games and VR. And then there's that whole philosophical question of, well, do you think, given what you've seen in the world, that technology will continue to improve and they will eventually make a virtual reality simulation that's indistinguishable from real life? You'd say, yeah, I could see that being possible. And then they say, well, is it more likely that you exist in the very rare sliver of time in which that might be invented down the road? Or is it more possible that in the grand continuum of life, once that's created, it's just created? And maybe you are in that right now. Maybe you're in one of thousands and you don't realize it, because when you put your quarter in to play the game, the first thing it does is shut off your memory that it's a game so that it feels fun and exciting with consequences. I like that as an analogy and as a philosophical exercise, but I don't really think it's a simulation in that sense. I really go back to guys like Alan Watts, who would say that this plane was invented by God. I mean, I'm not really a religious person, but some kind of entity to experience itself subjectively, for consciousness to take, let's say it's the supreme point of light, this one extreme supreme consciousness, and it breaks itself off and it throws itself into a physical body so that it can experience a physical plane. I once had a psychedelic experience at Big Sur on LSD. The only time I've ever done it, I was on it doesn't even really matter, but I was on a bus tour for this movie Don Peyote that was coming out. That was Dan Fogler's psychedelic movie. We're going to all the different stops to the red carpets for this film. I got really lucky that he wanted to promote the show on my podcast and then invited me on this tour. So, when in Rome, I'm doing LSD with these guys and I cannot sleep. I'm on this bus and I'm laying there on the floor of the bus with the doors open, and it's Big Sur. It's a beautiful place. I'm hearing the waves crash and I'm looking up at this star and I just lock onto it and it starts talking to me. And granted, these are drugs, whatever. But we started to have this conversation. It started to tell me about like the history of the planets around it. It's like, oh yeah, these balls spin around and then there was life on this one. And then that civilization died out. And then there was life on this one. And then it got pretty advanced. And then it got cold and they died out. And I'm just like, wow, it's like telling me its life story like it's kind of matter of fact. And I'm like, well, what is the point? I'm saying to this star, I'm like, what is the point of my life? Like, you don't want to know anything about my life. It's pretty inconsequential. And the star's like, nah, not at all. Like, you know what chocolate tastes like, you know what sex is like, you know what emotions are like and interactions with people. It's like, and then it like asked me, it's like, have you ever gotten into a real fight? I was like, not really. But it was like, that would be fun to get into a fight. And it really did make me feel like consciousness is this fabric that permeates all living things, trees, grass, stars, everything. And if you can tap into the right frequency with psychedelics or without, you can communicate with any other form of consciousness. I truly do believe that now. And, you know, my friend Gordon White wrote the book, Starships, A Prehistory of the Spirits. And he's a magician, so he knows a lot about the spiritual side of things. And then he also knows a lot about prehistory. He's kind of like a Graham Hancock that folds in the occult, I would say, in his book. And yeah, I told him this story. And he was like, well, what do you think the ancients were doing for thousands of years? What do you think indigenous practices when they're drumming and working themselves up into a fever and looking up into the night sky? The stars are all they have. It's the only show in town. And if they found even once that these stars would talk back to them, of course, they're going to keep doing that over and over until it continues to happen. And then you end up building pyramids that are aligned to Orion's belt. You know, that's kind of, and it was just an interesting moment. So yeah, I don't know. I think that it's a simulation, kind of. It's more like a giant sandbox. I think the physical universe to me is a giant sandbox for consciousness to play in many different forms. Sometimes a tree, sometimes a human being, sometimes a star.
Well, Greg, thank you for hanging out in my sandbox. It was great meeting you, and great conversation.
Yeah, I look forward to having you on the Higherside Chats soon.
Looking forward to it. The Highersidechats.com. The Highersidechats.com. Do you want to tease? Well, let's see. This is gonna play in a couple of weeks. So just maybe give us why don't you just tease a favorite episode or one that's upcoming that you'd like to draw our attention to?
Well, there are so many favorites. Richard Dolan is great, who's been on a couple times. Dr. Joseph Farrell's been on a bunch of times. Chris Knowles, another personal favorite. But one of the ones I have coming up is with a guy who started a company in the 90s helping people move and expatriate to South America. And now he's very familiar with all kinds of opportunities in South America and the nuances between different countries. He explains it all. And it really got me jazzed up because I think a lot of people are looking at maybe jumping off this sinking ship. And I'm going from California to Florida. That's a half measure probably. And we'll see if it's good enough for me and my family. But that door is always open to really get outside of this empire if you really think it's not serving you, and live a more free and organic life that you're in control of somewhere in Central America. So that's coming up. The guy's name is Mike Cobb. And he got me jazzed up about the prospects for sure.
Always important to have an exit strategy. And here's where we exit. But thank you again, Greg.
Thank you.
A new Richard Syrett's Strange Planet drops every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Subscribe at strangeplanetpodcast.com.